Go
Well,
ahead.
thank you for inviting us to speak. And though Anna and I have been talking about this when we saw those that were participating, imposter syndrome loomed large. So hopefully we have something to say. So as they opened their introduction to the 2015 special edition of Theory and Psychology, Unplugging the Milgram Machine, Gus Brannigan, Ian Nicholson and Francis Cherry update the reader on the lively status of Milgram studies as the 50th anniversary of the famous experiments arrived in 2013. They tell us about the 50th anniversary conference, which involved 30 presentations by over 50 speakers. They point to a number of retrospectives that were published too in various journals and magazines, both critical and celebratory. And of course, to those we can add the Theory and Psychology special edition the authors are introducing. We might also add Gina Perry's book that cut through to a mass market audience beyond academic psychology. Gus Brannigan's books, one from the late 90s, The Rise and Fall of Social Psychology, and the recent heavily reworked and retitled version, The Use and Misuse of Experimental Method in Social Psychology, both of which have Milgram's experiment as a significant early target. And then the Stephen Gibson's relatively recent book, Arguing, Obeying and Defying. These are all books that we like very much. I use we there, I don't know, I'm speaking for Anna. These are all books that we like very much. And, you know, to be frank, I mean, Gus Brannigan's books had a huge influence on me, the first edition. And I wouldn't like to presume we could add anything more to that. You know, these are real scholars in the field. So what more can be said? As we said, we'd recommend Perry, Brannigan and Gibson to anyone who wanted to know more about Milgram's experiments and the many problems with them. We'd recommend the Theory and Psychology special issue too. Does more need to be added? Well, there seem to be two ways you might go if you're asked to contribute to the ongoing discussion today. One would be to bring a new lens to the existing data in the hope that will bring light to new aspects, perhaps. And the other is to take a step back and to try and approach it for another first time, so to speak, to coin Harold Garfinkel's memorable phrase, to try and affect a naivety and ask what's wrong here. So examples of the first approach might be found in the recent work which seeks to employ conversation analytic techniques and policies in rereading the debriefing data. So they look at the data that Gina Perry looked at in the archive, for example, and based a lot of her work on. And they reanalyze that using the techniques of conversation analysis. And those papers are by Matthew Hollander and various co-authors. We find these less helpful than we hoped as someone who's sympathetic to conversation analysis, particularly the very early stuff, Habersack's work. I found these not very helpful. So that leaves us with two. And this is the option that we seek to do. And we might call this the forest and trees approach. So in a recent session of a reading group I facilitate, an ethnomethodology reading group, we read some of the recent CA literature on Milgram by Hollander and Turovitz. This took a CA approach to the debrief transcripts. As the discussion entered its second hour of this work, of the Hollander and Turovitz, there was a sense that the narrow focus on the minutiae of the debrief transcripts didn't really pay dividends. It just led you to dig deeper, and perhaps a step back might serve as better, stepping back and taking a bigger view rather than going ever more focused on the minutiae. In saying that, then, when you take a step back and affect the naivety, you know, how do we even get started in thinking of these experiments as telling us about anything about the Holocaust? This is not to say that recent focus on the various aspects of the experiment is not warranted, such as a focus on the debrief transcripts. Only to say that in focusing on those transcripts, in focusing on the rhetorical role of the film in publicising the experiments, another example of recent work, and so on, we do get more detailed knowledge of the trees that comprise the forest, but we miss the forest, so to speak. We miss the bigger picture. Now, this would be fine if nothing were lost by missing the forest, missing the bigger whole. But that's what we want to argue. There is something lost, and that's what we want to explore. To continue the analogy for a moment, our narrow focus is what leads us, perhaps, to see the tree as just a tree, not as a tree which is partly constitutive of the forest. In seeing just the tree, it is not that we miss the forest, but that we change the status of the tree we are viewing, because we do not see the tree as constitutive of the forest, but as just a tree. Okay, so some of you might be ahead of us here and see that, you know, we're not just riffing on an idiom here. You know, what we're trying to do by taking this idiom, okay, of not seeing the forest for the trees, okay, is leads us into Gestalt psychology and Gestalt theory, okay, and the relationship between parts and wholes. So we're not merely riffing on an idiom here. The idiom gestures at Gestalt-like relations in which the figure and ground, or constituents and whole, or members and the Gestalt, are symbiotically and internally related. The identity of the figure, constituent, member is related to its function in or relationship to the ground, the whole, or the Gestalt, of which it is a constituent, a figure, or a member. So this path via the forest and trees approach leads us then to lay emphasis on how the details, the constituents, have the identity they do because of the context of which they are a part. We're not just looking too closely such that we miss the big picture, the forest. Looking too closely and missing the bigger picture means that what you are looking closely at is seen under the wrong aspect. Okay, you don't see it as what it is because its identity is inextricably related to its part in the whole. So in focusing in, you stop seeing it as part of the whole because you haven't got a picture of the whole in play, and you just see it as an element, as a discrete item, so to speak, rather than as a constituent or a member. So there are two related points here. What do we miss in looking too closely? That is to say, what is the bigger picture we're missing? And then second, when we see this bigger picture, what does that do to the identity or the meaning of those constituents or members? So let's step back. Let's seek to affect a naivety and look at the Milgram obedience experiments for another first time. And this is what I sought to do. When I stepped back and just looked at Milgram's experiments with a kind of affected naivety and thought about them in relation to the Holocaust, and particularly Christopher Browning's relaying of Reserve Police Battalion 101's genocidal visit to Josaphat, then suddenly everything seemed wrong, and I couldn't believe that I'd not been struck by this before. The focus on the details before had stopped me seeing the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is when you see the bigger picture, it just seems so obviously wrong. So much of the detailed argument about the debrief, for example, so much of the detailed academic critiques of the last 10 years and beyond just seem to pale in significance next to one glaring observation. How did anyone come to design that experiment in the hope that they might learn about that atrocity. I mean, anybody that's read Christopher Browning's book, you know, it's one of the most powerful pieces of literature in any genre you could ever read. The detailing of, you know, the detailing of the day-to-day, sorry, the hour-to-hour actions of that police battalion, removing the Jewish population from the town, the digging of the grave, etc. It stays with you for life, you know. And the thought that an experiment in a psychology lab at Yale could tell us something about that. How do we even get beyond that? I mean, can you imagine, you know, if a psychologist, a kind of latter-day Milgram, decided to conduct some experiment that had a similar way of sanitizing what actually went on, that was on rape or something like that, there would be outrage. It wouldn't get past the ethics committee. It wouldn't get past the methodological stage, and so that was that's the kind of elephant in the room here, if you like, if I'm going to mix my metaphors of trees and forests and elephants in rooms. The elephant in the forest, perhaps. But that's the elephant in the room here, is how did we even get started on thinking that this could tell us anything about this? How did we get started on thinking staff from a university being paid to participate in an experiment in a lab on the campus of Yale in the United States could tell us anything about members of a police battalion doing what they did in Yozefzow? And I think part of the answer to that is you know what I'm trying to tease out here, in a way, and that's the way we think. We have this sort of, you know, when the Gestalt psychologists first put forward their critique, they criticized elementalism, you know, and there's a sense, you know, when you look at Wittgenstein's critique of language, there's a similar critique in place, and it's this idea that you know, words have their own meaning, that meaning isn't inextricably related to the context in which the words are used. Okay, and the same thing with the Gestalt psychologists. You know, what they wanted to argue against, excuse me, was elementalism, and the idea that what we perceive are elements that are then combined in some way in the mind. And so the famous examples of Gestalt phenomena, the Gestalt pictures that we're all familiar with now, were ways of demonstrating that that's not the case. You know, if you see the dog rather than just a pebbly beach, if you see the dog on the beach, then, you know, you're seeing a figure in the context of the ground, and you've got a differentiation between the figure and the ground, and you can't see one without the other. The Reuben vase is another example, but you'll be familiar with those. So that tendency to elementalism or analytic thinking is perhaps one of the things that makes Milgram think that you can make this radical switch of context without losing anything of significance. I'm sure, you know, I don't doubt for a minute that he was aware that there was there was something lost, but he didn't think that what was lost between, for example, Reserve Police Battalion 101 in Yozefzow and members of the Yale administrative staff being paid to participate in a trial on the way home from work in a lab on campus. He just didn't think that the difference was significant with regards to obedience, for example. So seeing the whole and seeing the identity of the constituent. So there are many things we might see anew, having taken our step back, that here we'll just focus on obedience just to get a discussion going. So what obedience is in Yosefal and what it is in the lab and what it is in the lab at Yale are two different things. They're different uses of the same term, but it's the use that's important. The meaning is related to the use, okay, not to the term in abstraction from any use. Okay.
I was just as Phil, I was struck by this idea that there was something bizarre happened with the use of the notion of obedience, because it was just reified, right? We had the impression that there is genuinely something behind the obedience that should be discovered, right? That is not here and that you have to dig to discover. And there was this in Milgram experiment and also in Zimbardo, I think there is this idea. I feel that, you know, Holocaust is not enough. There is something more to be known. There is some mystery behind the Holocaust. Holocaust seems to be just something superficial that we should, you know, that should be uncovered just in order to see something more genuine, right? And this approach, I think, is completely missing the particularity of the Holocaust. And I'm not saying here, I'm not entering here into the debate or whether Holocaust was something absolutely particular in the whole history of humanity or not. This is a German debate, and I live Germans with that. But there is the very idea that there is something more interesting in Holocaust than Holocaust. I think that this is the mistake of the whole approach, and I really find it fascinating to follow the discussion between researchers who spoke about it recently. Why there is no why, and in another paper, Paul Roth quotes Primo Levi, who says, well, there is no why, obviously, in the context of Auschwitz. But what is this lacking why that Paul Roth is going to explore? Well, Roth, apparently he's getting close to the conclusions by Hannah Arendt at some point, in the sense that Hannah Arendt said that, well, we have to stop from digging in a way, because the evil is not going to show itself. So there is nothing, there is something disappointing from the point of view from intellectual point of view in the evil of the Holocaust in general. I don't think it's the best conclusion. I mean, in the sense that there are so many tiny warum that should be asked, right? And this is what Phil, I think, alluded to when he spoke about the analysis of the details of what was going on in the particular setting of Browning's book, but also in general in the context of the Holocaust. So there are so many tiny warum to be asked, that to think that there's one big question of obedience that would solve all the mystery of the Holocaust is completely misleading. Right. So this is the worry that guided me here, and I follow here, and this is rare that I quote Horkheimer, but why not? Warum nicht, right? If you don't want to talk about capitalism, then you had better keep quiet about fascism, right? Which means that I'm not subscribing to the details of this thesis, but this is just an example about what kind of conversations we could have engage in the warum of what happens during the Holocaust. And this is one of the many questions that remain relevant without having one question of obedience as the only guiding force in this discussion. And yeah, so the whole debate was, I think, extremely interesting, and I really learned a lot while working on it. Well, obviously, this debate between since I see that at least one of my students is in the room, so I'm just going to give some details about the the literature in this area, because I think it's worthy. So there is this, of course, attempt by Adorno to explain the totalitarian personality by psychology. This attempt was challenged by Milgram in the first place, then Bauman, then of course Zimbardo, and with this idea that everything is social. Okay, so Bauman says, for example, that cruelty is social in its origin more than it is characterological. But what does he even mean by social here? Like, social is not the group that is isolated in time and in space. Socially, it should mean historical. It should mean, everything, if you take social seriously. And this understanding of the social, as it is proposed by Milgram and Zimbardo, whatever, this understanding of social is completely based on misunderstanding of what is going on, right? Of what matters in I think human relations. So this is our general worry. I'm not going to read everything that is written here, but I really thought it was very interesting to have this discussion. So first, of course, Browning and this idea of this idea according to which this is all about, obedience. No, I'm simplifying right now. It's not this. The response to Browning comes from Daniel Goldhagen, whose thesis was basically that Holocaust happened not because there was a social structure that allowed it, but because Holocaust was wanted, because Germans were anti-Semitic. So this is kind of extremely critical response to Browning's thesis. And Paul Roth is proposing a very interesting kind of synthesis of these two positions, and says at the end of his paper that maybe our salvation is due to our manipulability, in the sense that, well, there is nothing genuinely deep here in this obedience movement, etc. There's nothing to be genuinely explained. So as simple as it looks, the idea of being put in the situation of becoming a perpetrator, it is also very simple to make people, nice, thanks to the different kinds of manipulations. So for me, the problem is, this discussion is fascinating, and I really enjoyed reading things here, but still I have the impression that each and every author is trying to isolate one thing that would be, one explanatory factor. I don't know which one I prefer. If I had to take a position here, I think that's, personally, I would go for Goldhagen if I had to, but it is not as simple, I think. I think that what is going on here is more a struggle about the human nature in general, right, than the struggle to explain what happens during the Holocaust. So it's not really maybe about the best explanatory model for sociology or different disciplines, but rather it's an anthropological quest that hides its genuine aims, so to speak. So in this, from this perspective, it is extremely interesting too. And yeah, well, I just think that's, I'm quoting here one of my favorite writers from Poland, and he just says, well, there are many things here at play, right? So just it has been a multifactorial event that has to be analyzed with all the humility of someone who is trying to understand something extremely complex. So yeah, this is my position here, and I'm done. I hope, Philip, that I feel that I didn't betray you somehow.
I'll tell you now. Yeah, I think I'd like to, I guess, clarify my position, because this has been something, I wrote my PhD at the end of the 1990s, and it was on shame, but it was structured around Primo Levi's writings on shame. And Christopher Browning's book, as I said earlier, was hugely influential, and I very firmly came down on the side of Browning versus Goldhagen, and I wasn't a fan of Goldhagen's book at all. But I always, I had to turn a blind eye to the afterword on Milgram, I guess. Because I also, for a different set of reasons, just wasn't, I'm not persuaded that what Milgram did was, defensible intellectually, and as things have turned out in other ways, ethically either. So how do I align that? How of my ideas changed, if they have? Well, they haven't, because whenever I talked, and it's probably one of the academic books I've recommended most to people throughout my relatively short academic career, is Christopher Browning's book. It just seems to me as one of the best examples of how to write good history. It stays very close to the data. It's very careful in the way, it's the narrative is put together from the data. And there's sections of it 20 years after I read it that I can recall as if I read it yesterday now, which, and you can't say any of that about Daniel Goldhagen's book. That was a sort of rhetorical tour de force. Lots of, kind of graduate school methodological statements made in the first quarter of it that aren't then followed through in the last 3 quarters of it. And I guess, so the way I would try and work it out, given what I've just said today, is that I think the juxtaposition that Goldhagen sets up between the 2 books, I actually think is a little misleading, and I think that's the way I will put it. And because it's, if we're to argue that everybody is capable of doing what Reserve Police Battalion 101, for example, did, every human being is capable of doing that given the right conditions. That's not to say that eliminativist anti-Semitism didn't play a role. That's just one of the paths that would take you from not doing it to doing it. So the idea that these 2 things are necessarily opposed, I'd be interested to hear what Professor Browning's line on this is. I remember reading the preface to the 2nd edition of the book, where he responded a little to Goldhagen, but I can't remember the details of it now. But I guess that's the way I think now, that there's nothing in Professor Browning's book that, says context doesn't matter, and that obedience in a psychology lab in Yale in the early 60s is that it has the same sense, in the philosophical sense of sense, has the same sense as obedience in Josefau for Reserve Police Battalion 101. There's nothing in his book that makes that argument. He's just arguing that, this is something that we're all capable of given the right conditions. And that, to me, seems an important moral point. I guess the disagreement would be, very respectfully, is I don't think you need Milgram to make that point. I think it's there in the details of the book and the archival work that Professor Browning did. So maybe I'll stop there so other people can speak.
Many thanks, and Phil, for your talks. And you raised many questions, and I'm very glad that you started, actually, because you raised the two most important questions. First, what can be said after all that has already been said, and second, your insights, Phil, that you presented. It's the insight that is behind the idea of the conference. So the idea how you phrased it very well. That's how can someone imagine that something happening in Yale could have any relation with what happened in Józefov. But then this leads me to my question, because I thought I was pretty critical also about my formulation of this problem, and so maybe you could help me, because I will give you the question that I was giving to myself. So first, there is this whole literature on the Milgram Holocaust linkage. So in a way, this question is already was raised. So when you say, or when I say that this is a new question, actually it's not so much a new question. So I think it's possible to answer to this objection. And the second objection I wanted to make you is that, so I think that your reading of Milgram's gesture, to call it like this, takes into account Christopher Browning's book, but Milgram didn't know it. So the historiography that he had in mind, it was more like a Hilberg view of the Holocaust, the idea that it was a bureaucratic process. And then it makes more sense to have to make this connection between a bureaucratic situation and another bureaucratic situation. So these were, I'm sorry, I frame it as objections, but actually it's against myself. I hope that you could help me to just.
No. I think the second point. I think you're absolutely right. So that is, it's even though I'm not a big fan of Milgram's experiments, and I try and resist saying I'm not a big fan of Milgram, but I'm not a big fan of his experiments. I think yes, it's unfair of me to set up the contrast with Józef when, as you say, it's Raoul Hilberg's, the sort of the mundane bureaucratic nature of scheduling the trains, that sort of stuff is what is interested in. So actually, I need to just take that on the chin, so to speak. I think. So I think that's a valid criticism. Could you remind me of the first point again?
The first point is.
Sorry, I remember it. Yes, and again, that's. I should have been clearer. It's not that no one's ever asked this question. It's just that it's, in the same way that if we're to follow the analogy with the woods, the trees and the forest closely, it's not like people don't know they're in a forest. Okay, they've entered the forest, they're looking at the trees. It's that they get so focused on the trees that the obviousness of the forest just drops out of the picture, right? It just becomes something in the background. And I think that's what's happened here is, new archive material on the experiments has come to the surface. Gina Perry looked at that. Other people then, so the conversation analysis people go and re-look at that archival material. And then, and that's why in the slides, I tried to explain the context of me just having this thought an hour into the discussion of the conversation analytic material on the debrief transcripts, just thinking, whoa, what we're doing here, we spent an hour and there's this elephant in the room, which is, no, surely we can't lose sight of this, because this is the most important thing. And so what I was trying to do was articulate, you know, the philosophical underpinnings of that, if you like, how to articulate that in a philosophical way. And, you know, I drew on Gestalt psychology. At first, I was going to draw on Wittgenstein and the rule following, but it just felt far too abstract. And I thought the Gestalt, talking about it in terms of Gestalt examples, was more accessible. So yes, I think it's an important point. I should have said, rather than no one's spoken about it, I should have said it's just something that drops out of the picture because it's so obvious. Wittgenstein says something like, you know, we don't see that which is before our eyes. You know, it's so familiar that we stop taking notice of it and we stop seeing it. And I think something like that has gone on here. Sorry, Anna, you were going to say.
No, I was just to respond also to this first question that I have heard asked. I really, what worries me in this area is really the fact that great data, like new information is being reduced through things through the lenses of theories that I think are, you know, not adding anything to the explanatory power of the data per se. And this is something I think that Milgram has this negative power on things, but also Foucault has quite a similar problem, that people sometimes use Foucault to explain something from the data, from the phenomena they're trying to describe. And instead of giving something stronger, they completely reduce, or they not completely reduce, but they don't add anything, and they are maybe seduced by some explanations. Whereas their own data, the first things that they bring, you know, are more or is more exciting to study as such, so to speak.
Thank you, Anna. So I just wanted to reply to Phil, but maybe there are other questions in the. Could you, if you have a question, could you write it in the chat? So I know that someone wants to ask something. So Phil, so thank you. I understand.
Sorry, just to clarify, Raphael, you don't mean them to write the question, just say that they'd like to ask a question.
No, just a question mark, for instance.
Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, I understand better what you mean by this insight, or seeing the forest and the tree. You have specifically in mind this excitement that these fabulous researchers have when they look into new documents about Milgram's experiment, and they analyze the details, and then you have the impression that you also had the same experience, but then you lost the relation with the Holocaust. So the more you go into the minutiae of what happened in Yale, then the more you lose the connection with what happened in the forest of Józefov. So I have the impression that it is what you meant, and yeah, I think it's a very good point. I wanted to respond to my own objections because I had also something to say. So I think that actually the real responsible for what you describe is Christopher Browning, because he knew the gesture of this gesture of applying Milgram to Józefov. He did it in the second chapter of his book. So maybe I don't know if he wants to say something about this, but. Actually, I think so. For me, I also his book is fabulous, and it makes me think so much, and it gave me so many questions, and so. But I think that actually the title of the conference, it's about Christopher Browning's gesture. He sees Józefov, and then he thinks, okay, he didn't go from Yale to Józefov. He went from Józefov to Yale. So this is a question. So how could So actually, I think your question is about Christopher Browning. And second, regarding the linkage between Milgram and the Holocaust. So for me, the conference is not the question of the theoretical linkage, but the methodological linkage. So I think it's, and actually I think you have the same idea, that the question is not whether we can apply these the analysis of Milgram to what analysis of Milgram can we apply to the Holocaust, but for me the question is how can experimental psychology can apply to historical event to help us explain historical events. So this is how I would say that it's not the same problem. It's a more general problem. It's a methodological problem of experiment on the one hand and historical events on the other hand.
Raphael, let's Professor Browning.
Yeah, sure. I said nothing. So Professor Browning.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I'm sorry, on the west coast of the United States, I didn't get up early enough to see the very beginning, but I'm very happy to have been able to join in. Just a couple of comments. First, to what Phil said, that Milgram wasn't essential to the book is absolutely true. Basically, I wrote the whole book except the concluding chapter, and all of that was there without Milgram or Zimbardo or social psychology. And at that point, I said, well, I need more insight into this. What will help us to understand what this empirical study means, or what can give us greater insight to it? And that's when I felt very much remember, this was 30 years ago, 1992, actually I was writing in 1990. The approach to perpetrator studies was primarily psychological. These were deranged or different people, abnormal people. What was the abnormality that caused them to do what they did? And my feeling very strongly was that looking at the dynamics of Police Battalion 101, we had to look at the interaction between people. It was the interaction between these people that was key, not that somehow you had gotten a collection of abnormal people thrown together in some non-coincidental way. So reading the social psychological literature of the time, to me, added insight to what I had already done in terms of describing what the battalion had done, how it had operated. And Milgram was only one part of that. Remember, in fact, I say in there, a killing field in Poland is not a laboratory. This is only going to give us partial insight. Milgram can affirm the importance of deference to authority as a factor in how group dynamic takes place. I never made it the explanation of the Holocaust, much less the explanation of Battalion 101. But it was one among a number of factors. And I said, even by Milgram's own terms, men like to invoke what he called the agentic theory because it shifted responsibility more than conformity. And I was clear from the testimony of the men themselves, conformity was more important than deference to authority. And so if conformity is the hidden iceberg, which Milgram himself said, then conformity was even more important than the weight that it appears in the testimony itself as a key factor in the interrelationship between the men, in the unit dynamic. At the time I did that, I had no idea that Milgram was such a red flag and would invoke such strong emotional responses. I was so naive, I just really didn't know the controversies that had surrounded this. I would have been more cautious, perhaps, if I'd realized I was going to kind of that there would be many reactions to my book based not upon what I had written, but based upon people's antipathy to Milgram. And it would be classified as the Milgram explanation, which I just must say it is not. Though I think Milgram adds a element that is useful as long as we see it as qualified. So I think in the post-92 post-Goldhagen debate, I think the most important contribution was made by Leonard Newman, who basically says this dichotomy of the situational and the ideological, or the dichotomy of the situational and the cultural, is a false dichotomy. That people read the situation they're in. If you had run the Milgram experiment with a New Guinea Highlander that didn't know what science was, obviously a man in a white coat and a clipboard saying what you're doing is important for science wouldn't mean anything, and the experiment wouldn't work. Likewise, the men of 101 come to Poland and read the situation they're in through many cultural assumptions of German society, that they don't have to be gung-ho Nazis or deep and conscious, fervent anti-Semites, but they will have, as to use the term one of the officers himself used in his testimony, the air they had breathed was Nazi for years before they got there. So obviously Nazi ideology and more general German attitudes towards Slavs in the East and the right to empire and so forth are going to shape how they read the situation they're in when they arrive at Józefów and a weeping commander tells them they're going to shoot unarmed women and children. So I do think that my book got positioned as sort of being the situational explanation and the social psychological explanation uniformly because it was put in opposition to Goldhagen, who made such a frontal assault upon it from that one direction. I think my book was much more multi-causal, and it was intended to be much more multi-causal, but it got positioned, I think, somewhat in an skewed fashion because the attack from Goldhagen was so vehemently from the direction of being a monocausal cultural ideological explanation. And I don't think that was really, if you go back to read the book now, I don't think I was anything as one-sided as in terms of a single or monocausal explanation as Goldhagen was, but my book got, in perception, pushed into that position. And I don't think if one goes back to it that without Goldhagen hovering, in a sense, the Goldhagen book then shaped how my book was interpreted, I think in a bit of an unfair way, or a bit distorted way, I guess to say. Well, I'll stop at that, but thanks for the papers, and I just wanted to reply to those several issues.
Yeah, no, thanks. You know, from a reader's perspective, you know, that's really how I saw it. I mean, to me, Goldhagen's book is making the structuralist argument, so to speak. You know, he's not interested in interaction, the production of maintenance and repair of social norms, and so I guess the kind of paradox of your book for me is somebody who's, you know, very much a fan of Harold Garfinkel's work and ethnomethodology, and you know, and the sort of old sociological social psychology that kind of got pushed out of psychology. You find that in sociology departments now, but in psychology departments, social psychology became something very different. It became the sort of experimental stuff that we know. But, you know, if you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, you know, a lot of what was called social psychology then was what we would think of as sociology now. It was interactional research. And it seemed to me the way you wrote your book, and that for me is why I liked it so much. You know, it has that sort of details of the interaction. And, you know, the most famous bit is when Trapp offers them the opportunity to step out and not do it. And some of them step, and he makes it clear that they won't, you know, they won't suffer any penalty for doing so, and they step out, and the second in command then berates them, and Trapp turns on the second in command and berates him and says, no, I'm serious. You know, if people, you know, if they want to step out, they can step out and they will not suffer any penalty. And that's the interactional detail, you know, that's the sort of thing that ethnomethodologists are interested in, because that's the point at which the social norms are being produced or maintained or repaired as they talk about it. And that's the stuff that somebody, you know, Milgram and that kind of experimental social psychology is just not interested in. It just stays silent on that sort of stuff. And I think, so the irony is that you know, as you just explained yourself, you attached, you know, a kind of innocently attached Milgram, and then your whole book gets kind of labeled because of that, and then doubly so when you have a whole group of people who only know your book through what Daniel Goldhagen says about it. And I think that's, you know, that must be very frustrating. You have my sympathies for that. But again, I'll just say that for me, the power of the book and why I still recommend it now, despite the Milgram section, is that to me, actually, it is an example of historical work that does something that, you know, as somebody who's sympathetic to ethnomethodology, you know, shows the production and the maintenance and the repair of social norms in the details of the narrative based on the historical, the archival work. And that's what good history should do, I think.